Some friendships are built over a lifetime. Others are forged in moments when two lives depend entirely on each other. In Spokane, Washington, a remarkable story about a retired Navy SEAL and the military K-9 who had served beside him for nearly a decade is about to unfold. It is a story of loyalty, loss, and a bond that would be tested when one ordinary afternoon separated them without warning. What followed would become a journey of heartbreak, hope, and a friendship that refused to be forgotten. Before we begin, tell us what city you're watching from today. We'd love to know how far this story travels. November arrived early in Spokane that year. The pine-covered hills north of the city had already darkened beneath low gray clouds, and the first traces of winter lingered in the morning air long before the snow officially arrived. Pickup trucks rolled past sporting goods stores with hunting gear strapped in the back, and conversations in diners often drifted toward deer season, weather forecasts, and which trails would remain open after the first storm. For Malcolm Hayes, it felt like the first season in a long time that belonged entirely to him. Nearly a year had passed since he had left the Navy SEAL teams. The transition hadn't been easy, but it had been manageable. He had found steady work as a field technician for an outdoor rescue equipment company, servicing emergency beacons, communication gear, and search and rescue equipment throughout eastern Washington. The work kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. Boone helped with that too. The German Shepherd had spent almost a decade beside him. They had crossed deserts together, boarded helicopters together, and survived more close calls than Malcolm cared to count. In public, people called Boone his dog. Malcolm usually nodded and let them think that. It was easier than explaining. Most mornings began the same way. Boone waited by the front door while Malcolm tied his boots. During weekends, they explored trails outside the city. In the evenings, Boone stretched out beside the bed while Malcolm watched late-night weather reports he rarely paid attention to. The rhythm wasn't exciting, it was peaceful. One Saturday afternoon, Malcolm loaded Boone into the truck and drove toward a familiar trail north of Spokane. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Fallen needles covered the ground, and patches of frost still lingered in shaded areas where sunlight hadn't reached. Boone moved comfortably beside him, ears alert, nose constantly working. Nothing felt unusual. Then Boone stopped. His posture changed instantly. Malcolm saw it happen before he understood why. The dog's head lifted. His body tightened. His attention locked onto something hidden beyond the trees. A scent. A wounded deer, most likely. Before Malcolm could shorten the lead, the leash snagged on a dead branch. The sudden pull snapped the worn section near the clasp. Boone lunged forward and disappeared into the forest. "Boone!" Malcolm's voice echoed between the trees. No response. He moved quickly at first, confident the dog would circle back. Boone had chased scents before. Training and instinct always brought him home. 10 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. The confidence faded. By sunset, Malcolm was still searching. That night, temperatures dropped below freezing. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, while Malcolm followed tracks that vanished as quickly as they appeared. He called Boone's name until his throat felt raw. Somewhere after midnight, he returned to the truck only long enough to grab fresh batteries and another jacket. Then he went back into the woods. The next morning brought no answers. Neither did the day after that, or the week after. Malcolm filed reports with local animal shelters and veterinary clinics. He contacted volunteer search groups. He printed flyers and taped them to gas station windows, grocery store bulletin boards, and trailhead information signs. A map soon covered one wall of his garage, marked with pins, notes, and every possible sighting anyone reported. His evenings became routine. Check messages, follow leads, drive, search, repeat. Weeks passed that way. Winter slowly settled across eastern Washington, frost-coated rooftops each morning. Christmas lights appeared on neighboring houses. Life continued moving forward for everyone else. Malcolm stayed focused on the same question. Where was Boone? He received dozens of calls. Most led nowhere. One caller had mistaken a husky for a German Shepherd. Another reported a dog nearly 50 miles away that turned out to be someone's missing farm animal. Each lead began with a spark of hope and ended with another long drive home. The garage wall kept growing. So did the silence. Malcolm had prepared for dangerous missions. He had trained for uncertainty. He had learned how quickly circumstances could change, but no training had prepared him for this. Some losses arrive without warning. 3 months after Boone disappeared, Malcolm's phone rang while he was finishing paperwork at work. The number was unfamiliar. A woman introduced herself as an employee from a shelter outside Spokane. A German Shepherd had just been found near a National Forest access road. According to the initial description, the dog's age, coloring, and overall appearance matched many of the details Malcolm had provided in his reports. The dog was still being transported. Would he be willing to come? And before we find out who was waiting at that shelter, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Thank you. For the first time in months, Malcolm allowed himself to imagine possibilities he had been carefully avoiding. The thought alone was enough to make his pulse quicken. Malcolm was already reaching for his truck keys before the conversation ended. The drive felt shorter than it really was. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine possibilities he had been carefully avoiding. He wondered whether Boone had lost weight. He wondered whether the dog would recognize him immediately. He wondered how many miles Boone had traveled and what had happened during the missing months. Outside the shelter, fresh snow had begun falling. Inside, everything smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet fur. A staff member greeted him and led him toward an intake room. "He's still settling in," she said quietly. Malcolm nodded. His heartbeat felt strangely loud. The door opened. A German Shepherd stepped inside. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The size looked right. The coloring looked right. Even the movement felt familiar. Hope surged through him so quickly it almost hurt. Then the dog turned its head. Malcolm's eyes moved automatically toward the area beneath the left eye. Boone had a small scar there from a training accident years earlier. A thin white mark. Impossible to miss if you knew where to look. The scar wasn't there. Malcolm stared for another second, then another. The truth settled quietly between them. This wasn't Boone. The shelter employee began apologizing immediately, but Malcolm shook his head. "It's okay," and he meant it. The dog hadn't done anything wrong. Neither had the people trying to help. He knelt beside the shepherd and scratched behind its ears. The animal leaned into the attention, tail moving cautiously against the floor. Malcolm stayed for several minutes, speaking softly and asking about the dog's condition. Eventually he stood, thanked everyone, and walked back outside. Snowflakes drifted across the parking lot beneath the yellow glow of the streetlights. Malcolm climbed into his truck and closed the door. The heater hummed softly. Traffic moved somewhere in the distance. The engine never started. He simply sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the snow collect on the windshield. Hope can help people endure remarkable things. Sometimes it can make the disappointment hurt even more. And, for the first time since Boone disappeared, Malcolm felt something he had spent months refusing to acknowledge. He was getting tired. Winter came and went, then another and another. The map in Malcolm Hayes's garage eventually disappeared from the wall, but the tiny pinholes remained. They stayed there long after the papers were taken down, scattered across the plywood like faded reminders of places he had searched and roads he had traveled. Some evenings he still found himself staring at them while reaching for a wrench or a flashlight. Old habits linger. The phone calls became less frequent as time passed. Fewer people remembered the missing K9. Fewer shelters recognized Boone's name. New cases replaced old ones, and life moved forward the way life always does. Malcolm kept searching anyway, not every day. Not with the same urgency, but enough. Whenever he drove through a new town for work, he stopped by local shelters. Whenever he saw a social media post about a found German Shepherd, he looked. Whenever his phone rang late at night, a small part of him still wondered. Then came the job offer. The company he worked for had expanded its contracts with search and rescue organizations across the Northwest. A position had opened in Whitefish, Montana, helping maintain equipment for rescue teams operating throughout the Flathead Valley region. The salary wasn't dramatically better. The title wasn't particularly impressive. But it was something different. Malcolm stared at the offer for several days before responding. Outside his kitchen window, snow slid from the roof in heavy sheets. Boone's empty water bowl still sat beneath the counter. The leash hook by the back door remained untouched. Spokane felt smaller than it once had. Every trail reminded him of Boone. Every gas station carried memories. Even the grocery store near his apartment held echoes of routines that no longer existed. Some places become difficult to stay in. He accepted the job. The move happened in early spring. Patches of snow still clung to the shadows beneath the trees as Malcolm loaded boxes into a rented truck. Most of the process was simple: tools, clothes, furniture, kitchen supplies. Then he opened a storage cabinet. Inside sat Boone's collar. Next to it was a faded rubber toy that had survived years of chewing. Beneath both lay an old photograph taken during their final summer before retirement. Malcolm stood there for a while. Then he packed all three. Whitefish welcomed him with mountain air, narrow roads, and a slower pace of life than Spokane. The town sat beneath towering peaks that changed color with the weather. Some mornings, the mountains appeared sharp and clear against blue skies. Other days, they vanished completely behind low clouds and drifting snow. The work suited him. Rescue equipment rarely cared about feelings. Radios needed testing. Emergency beacons required maintenance. Search teams depended on reliable gear. There was comfort in solving problems that had solutions. The cabin he rented sat on the edge of town. Nothing fancy. A small porch, a detached garage, enough room for one person and the memories he carried with him. A few weeks after moving in, Malcolm met his nearest neighbor, Claire Bennett. The introduction happened because of a kayak. One Saturday afternoon, Malcolm was replacing a damaged antenna mount on his truck when he heard a frustrated voice from the property next door. Looking over the fence, he found a woman standing on a ladder, unsuccessfully trying to free a kayak trapped on an overhead storage rack inside her garage. The situation wasn't dangerous, just stubborn. The kayak won, for almost 20 minutes. Eventually, Malcolm walked over and helped lower it safely. Claire laughed at herself afterward. Malcolm managed something close to a smile. That became the beginning. Over the following months, they crossed paths often. Claire worked as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation clinic in town. Her schedule was unpredictable. Her garage was constantly disorganized. She possessed an impressive ability to start projects she wasn't fully prepared to finish. Malcolm fixed things. Claire appreciated it. Neither made a big deal about it. Then there was Murphy. The golden retriever arrived in Malcolm's life long before he intended. Murphy belonged to Claire and seemed convinced that every human being existed solely to become his friend. He carried tennis balls everywhere, greeted strangers like long-lost relatives, and occasionally stole gardening gloves for reasons known only to himself. Boone had never behaved like that. Boone observed first. Murphy charged ahead. Boone worked. Murphy played. Boone could sit perfectly still for hours if required. Murphy struggled to remain still for 30 seconds. The differences were impossible to miss. One afternoon, Claire asked Malcolm if he could watch Murphy for a few hours while she attended an unexpected work meeting. Malcolm agreed before thinking too hard about it. Murphy spent most of the afternoon following him around the yard. When Malcolm repaired a loose fence panel, Murphy watched. When Malcolm organized tools in the garage, Murphy watched. When Malcolm sat on the porch drinking coffee, Murphy climbed onto the porch and rested nearby. It wasn't unpleasant, just unfamiliar. The following week, Murphy wandered into Malcolm's cabin through an open door and immediately discovered the old dog bed stored near the fireplace. Before Malcolm could react, the golden retriever had curled up comfortably on it. The room grew quiet. Murphy sighed contentedly and settled deeper into the cushion. For a moment, Malcolm simply stood there. Then he walked over, gently encouraged the dog to move, and carried the bed into a spare room. No anger, no irritation, just a decision. Later that evening, Claire noticed. She didn't ask questions immediately. The answers arrived on their own. Over time, she learned about Boone. Not through dramatic conversations or emotional confessions, but through small details. A photograph on a bookshelf. A collar hanging inside a closet. The way Malcolm sometimes paused when he heard a German shepherd bark somewhere in town. People rarely reveal themselves all at once. The years continued. The sharp edges of grief softened, though they never disappeared entirely. Malcolm built a life in Whitefish. He knew local store owners by name. He became familiar with seasonal weather patterns. He learned which roads flooded in spring and which trails remained accessible after heavy snow. Life became manageable. Then one autumn afternoon, nearly 5 years after Boone disappeared, Malcolm's phone rang while he was finishing maintenance paperwork at the rescue facility. The number was unfamiliar. He almost ignored it. Almost. A woman introduced herself from an animal shelter in Montana. Her voice sounded calm, professional. She explained that a German Shepherd had recently been brought in as a stray. During intake processing, staff had scanned the dog's microchip. The registration returned a name, Malcolm Hayes. For several seconds, neither person spoke. Outside the office window, wind pushed fallen leaves across the parking lot. Inside, Malcolm tightened his grip on the phone. The woman asked if he was still the registered owner. Malcolm looked down at the paperwork spread across his desk. Then he answered, yes. And suddenly, after 5 years of silence, hope returned. Malcolm barely remembered ending the phone call. One moment he was sitting at his desk inside the rescue equipment facility. The next, he was standing in the parking lot with his truck keys in his hand, staring at the mountains beyond town. The late autumn wind pushed leaves across the pavement while employees came and went around him. Everything looked normal. Nothing felt normal. The shelter was nearly 3 hours away, long enough for doubt to settle in. As the miles rolled beneath his tires, Malcolm kept replaying the conversation in his head. The microchip had matched. The registration information was current. The shelter employee sounded confident. Still, 5 years had taught him caution. Hope could be dangerous. The road wound through valleys dusted with early snow. Pine forests stretched across the hillsides, dark against the pale sky. At a gas station halfway through the trip, Malcolm bought a coffee he never finished. The cup sat untouched in the holder beside him. His hands stayed on the steering wheel. His thoughts stayed somewhere else. By the time he reached the shelter, the sun had already begun dropping behind the mountains. The building itself was modest. A few parked vehicles stood outside. Wind rattled a flag near the entrance. Somewhere behind the structure, a dog barked once and then fell silent. A woman met him at the front desk. "Mr. Hayes?" Malcolm nodded. She offered a small smile. "We've been expecting you." The walk down the hallway felt strangely familiar. The scent of disinfectant, the distant sounds of animals, the metal doors. Malcolm had visited enough shelters over the years to recognize all of it. This time felt different. The woman stopped beside a kennel room. "He was pretty scared when he arrived," she said quietly. "But he's been calm the last couple of days." She opened the door. Malcolm stepped inside. A German Shepherd stood near the far wall. For a second, neither moved. The dog looked older than the Boone Malcolm remembered. Much older. Gray fur spread across his muzzle and around his eyes. One ear no longer stood completely upright. His frame looked thinner. One back leg carried a slight limp, and a faint cloudiness had settled over his left eye. Time had left its marks. The dog stared. Malcolm stared back. His throat tightened. Boone. The name barely left his lips. The shepherd tilted his head. Then he took a few slow steps forward. Not running, not leaping, not like the reunions people imagined. Just walking. Carefully, as if he were searching through years of memories. The room became very quiet. Boone stopped a few feet away and lifted his nose. Malcolm crouched. Neither moved. Then the dog leaned forward and sniffed his hand. 1 second, 2, 3, something changed. Boone's posture softened. His tail moved once, then again. The next moment, the old shepherd pressed his head against Malcolm's chest. Malcolm closed his eyes. For 5 years he had imagined this moment. None of those versions felt anything like the real thing. The shelter staff quietly stepped out of the room. Neither Malcolm nor Boone noticed. They stayed there together for a long time. Eventually, Malcolm's eyes drifted toward the area beneath Boone's left eye. The scar was still there, a thin white line, small, ordinary, unmistakable, the same scar that had told him another dog wasn't Boone years earlier. The same scar that now erased every remaining doubt. This was him. This was really him. Hours later, Boone rode home in the passenger area of Malcolm's truck. The shepherd spent most of the journey sleeping. Sometimes he would wake briefly, lift his head, and look around before settling back down again. Age had slowed him, but some habits remained unchanged. Night had fallen by the time they reached Whitefish. The porch light glowed against the darkness. Boone paused at the bottom step. Then he slowly climbed onto the porch. The old cabin stood exactly where Malcolm had left it that morning. Yet somehow everything had changed. Murphy noticed first. The golden retriever appeared from Claire's yard the moment the truck door opened. His tail wagged furiously as he bounded toward the newcomer. Boone watched him approach. Murphy stopped a few feet away. For once, the usually enthusiastic retriever seemed uncertain. The older shepherd simply looked back, calm, patient. Neither growled, neither barked. After a moment, Murphy sat down. A truce, nothing more, nothing less. Claire arrived a minute later, still wearing her clinic jacket. She slowed when she saw the dog beside Malcolm. For several seconds she didn't speak. Then her eyes widened. "That's Boone?" Malcolm nodded. Claire looked from him to the shepherd and back again. A smile slowly appeared. "I'll be honest," she said softly. "I was starting to think I'd never meet him." Neither was Malcolm. The following days passed quietly. Boone explored the cabin room by room. He slept often. He ate slowly. Sometimes Malcolm would find him sitting near the back door, staring toward the mountains as if remembering something no one else could see. Murphy continued visiting. The younger dog brought toys. Boone ignored most of them. Murphy persisted anyway. Claire helped where she could, occasionally dropping off meals or stopping by to check on the old shepherd. Life settled into a rhythm Malcolm had not expected to experience again. For the first time in years, the dog bed beside the fireplace was occupied. For the first time in years, another set of paws crossed the cabin floor each morning. For the first time in years, the silence had changed. Then one evening, while reviewing paperwork the shelter had provided, Malcolm noticed a name he didn't recognize. Walter Jensen. The name appeared several times in the records. Veterinary visits, temporary ownership documentation, emergency contact notes. The dates stretched across nearly 4 years. Malcolm read the pages twice. Then a third time. According to the records, Boone had spent much of his missing time living with an elderly widower named Walter Jensen. The man had passed away the previous year. Shortly afterward, Boone had somehow ended up wandering again, before eventually being found and brought to the shelter. Malcolm lowered the papers. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the porch light. Inside, Boone slept beside the fireplace. For years, Malcolm had believed he was the only person still missing him. The paperwork told a different story. Somewhere along the way, another lonely man had opened his home to an aging shepherd. And somewhere along the way, Boone had become family again. Just not to Malcolm, not yet. The first snowfall of December arrived quietly. By morning, Whitefish looked softer than it had the day before. The mountains beyond town wore fresh layers of white, and the roofs along Malcolm Street carried a thin blanket of snow that sparkled beneath the winter sun. Inside the cabin, Boone slept near the fireplace while Murphy lay stretched across the rug a few feet away. The two dogs had settled into an uneasy friendship. Murphy still carried toys over several times a day. Boone still ignored most of them. Some things never changed. A week after Boone's return, Malcolm called the shelter again. The questions had been growing inside him ever since he saw Walter Jensen's name in the paperwork. 5 years was a long time. Boone hadn't simply vanished and reappeared. There was a story hidden inside those missing years. Malcolm wanted to understand it. The shelter employee connected him with Walter's daughter, Emily Jensen. A few days later, Malcolm drove south to meet her. Emily lived in a small ranch house outside Kalispell. The place overlooked open pasture land where snow drifted against old wooden fences. Wind chimes hung from the porch roof, producing soft metallic notes whenever the breeze picked up. She greeted Malcolm warmly. Then she looked past him toward Boone. For a moment, her smile faded, not from sadness, recognition. "Well," she said softly. "Look at you." Boone slowly walked toward her. His tail moved once, then again. Emily knelt beside him and scratched behind his ears. The old shepherd closed his eyes. Neither seemed surprised to see the other. Inside the house, Emily brought out several photo albums. Most of them belonged to her father. One photograph showed Walter Jensen sitting beside a lake, fishing pole resting against a chair while Boone slept at his feet. Another showed the old man smiling beside a Christmas tree, with Boone wearing a red bandana around his neck. Another showed them sitting together on a porch swing during summer. Malcolm turned the pages carefully. Each photograph filled in a piece of the puzzle. Emily explained how it had happened. 5 years earlier, a truck driver had spotted Boone wandering dangerously close to a highway outside Montana. The dog appeared exhausted and injured. Animal control picked him up and eventually transferred him to a shelter. Walter had been volunteering there at the time. His wife had died only months earlier. The house had become painfully quiet. The shelter staff convinced him to foster Boone temporarily. Temporary became permanent. "He saved my dad," Emily said. The statement hung in the room. Outside, snow tapped lightly against the windows. Inside, Boone slept near the fireplace. "He stopped eating much after Mom died," Emily continued. "Stopped fishing, stopped leaving the house." Then Boone came along. She smiled at the memory. The dog followed him everywhere. Malcolm looked down at one of the photographs. Walter looked happy. Not pretending, not surviving, actually happy. For years Malcolm had thought about everything Boone had lost. Now he was discovering what Boone had given. Later that afternoon, Emily introduced Malcolm to two of Walter's former neighbors. Both remembered Boone immediately. The old shepherd had become something of a local celebrity in the small community. Children recognized him. Store owners kept treats behind counters for him. One neighbor laughed while describing how Boone had accompanied Walter to nearly every town meeting. He was better known than some people around here. The stories continued. Each one revealed a different side of the missing years. Not all of them were pleasant. As Malcolm pieced together the timeline, gaps began to emerge. Periods of several months remained unexplained. A shelter volunteer later helped fill some of those gaps. After Walter's death, Boone had not immediately arrived at the shelter where Malcolm eventually found him. Instead, he had passed through several temporary situations. Different people, different homes, different outcomes. Some had tried to help. Others had simply treated him as an inconvenience. The record showed multiple transfers, short stays, missing documentation, missed opportunities. One report noted that Boone had worn a collar for part of that period. Another mentioned that no one had scanned for a microchip. Not once. Malcolm sat quietly while reading. A familiar frustration settled inside him. Not rage. Something colder. 5 years. 5 years during which a simple scan could have changed everything. 5 years during which Boone had belonged somewhere. 5 years during which people looked at an aging German shepherd and kept walking. Outside the shelter parking lot, Malcolm paused before getting into his truck. Snow drifted through the afternoon air. For the first time, he felt grateful and angry at the same time. Grateful for Walter. Angry at everyone else. Back in Whitefish, life slowly found a rhythm again. Boone grew stronger. Murphy remained persistent. Claire continued stopping by with excuses that were becoming increasingly transparent. Extra soup, leftover pie. Questions about things that didn't really need fixing. Malcolm didn't mind. Neither did Boone. Weeks passed. Christmas lights appeared throughout town. Local businesses decorated storefront windows. The rescue facility hosted a holiday breakfast where someone inevitably asked Malcolm how the famous dog was doing. For the first time in years, the answer felt easy. He's doing good. And for a while, that seemed true. Malcolm had started believing the worst was finally behind them. But the body often remembers injuries long after memories fade. The collapse happened on an ordinary evening. One moment Boone was resting near the fireplace. The next, he struggled to stand. His legs trembled, then gave way completely. The old shepherd crashed onto the floor. Murphy barked sharply. Claire froze. Malcolm was already moving. By the time they reached the veterinary hospital, Boone had suffered a seizure, then another. Tests began immediately. Hours passed. Machines hummed. Veterinarians moved in and out of examination rooms. Nobody offered answers right away. The waiting felt familiar, too familiar. Near midnight, the lead veterinarian finally entered the consultation room carrying several images. He placed them on the table. There it is. A small metallic fragment appeared near Boone's spine. Tiny, easy to miss, potentially devastating. The veterinarian explained that it had likely been there for years. Possibly the result of a severe accident sometime during Boone's missing period. The fragment had shifted. Now it was creating pressure. The seizures would likely continue. Without intervention, things could become much worse. Surgery carried risks, especially for an aging dog. Malcolm listened without interrupting. Outside the window, snow continued falling across the parking lot. Inside, the room felt very still. A few hours later, Boone was wheeled towards surgery. The shepherd looked exhausted, but when Malcolm spoke his name, one ear lifted. The same way it always had. The surgical team disappeared through a set of double doors. The doors closed, and Malcolm sat down to wait. Just as he had done years earlier in military hospitals, just as he had done for wounded teammates, just as he had done countless times before. Only this time, the person on the other side of the door walked on 4 legs. The surgery lasted longer than anyone expected. By the second hour, the veterinary hospital had grown quiet in the way medical places sometimes do late at night, with phones ringing less often and footsteps sounding louder against polished floors. Snow pressed softly against the windows, blurring the parking lot lights into pale yellow halos. Malcolm sat in the waiting room with his elbows on his knees, hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles had gone white beneath the old scars. Claire stayed beside him. She did not offer speeches or promises she could not keep. She simply sat there, sometimes leaving to bring coffee, sometimes returning with a paper cup of water he forgot to drink. When the clock above the reception desk passed midnight, she folded her coat over the back of the chair beside him and asked if he needed anything. Malcolm shook his head. The answer was not exactly true. He needed the double doors to open. He needed the surgeon to walk out with good news. He needed time to stop taking things from him in pieces. But those were not things Claire could give, so she stayed. A little after 1 in the morning, the surgeon finally stepped into the hallway. His face was tired, his surgical cap still in one hand, and for a moment Malcolm could not read anything in his expression. Then the man gave a small, careful nod. Boone had survived. The fragment had been removed, and the pressure near the spine had been relieved, but the surgeon made it clear that survival was only the first part of the battle. Boone was old, his body had endured years of damage, and the next weeks would decide how much strength he could regain. Malcolm listened to every instruction without interrupting. He wrote everything down: medication times, restricted movement, short walks, follow-up visits. When they finally allowed him into the recovery room, Boone lay beneath warm blankets with a shaved patch along his back and an IV line taped carefully to one leg. The old shepherd looked smaller than Malcolm remembered, reduced for the moment to breathing, healing, and the soft rhythm of monitors beside him. Yet when Malcolm whispered his name, Boone's ear shifted faintly beneath the blanket. That tiny movement carried him through the night. Recovery did not arrive like a miracle. It came in difficult, ordinary increments. At first, Boone could barely stand without help. Malcolm placed rugs across the slick cabin floor so the old shepherd would not slip, moved furniture out of the walking path, and set alarms on his phone for every dose of medicine. Some mornings Boone made it only as far as the porch before needing to rest, and some evenings he stared toward the yard with the frustrated patience of a working dog trapped inside an aging body. Malcolm learned to slow down with him. Claire became part of those days in a quiet way that never asked for attention. She stopped by after work with soup, bread, or groceries she claimed she had bought too much of by accident. Murphy usually arrived first, thundering across the yard with a tennis ball in his mouth, full of hope that Boone might finally accept one of his invitations to play. Boone rarely did. Murphy kept trying anyway. One afternoon, the golden retriever dropped a pine cone beside Boone's paw and sat back as if presenting a formal gift. Boone looked at it, looked at Murphy, and then nudged the pine cone with his nose, just far enough to send it rolling off the porch. Murphy chased it with such wild joy that Claire laughed until she had to lean against the railing. Malcolm smiled before he realized he had done it. By late winter, Boone was walking farther. His limp remained, and the cloudiness in his eye did not improve, but his appetite returned and his ears lifted more often at familiar sounds. He began following Malcolm from room to room again, not with the sharp precision of his younger years, but with the steady insistence of a dog who had decided he still had work to do. The house changed with him. It became less careful, less silent. In March, Malcolm made one final trip to see Emily Jensen and Walter's family. He brought a cardboard box filled with photographs from Boone's earlier life. Training fields, military kennels, quiet weekends in Washington, and a picture from the last summer before retirement when Boone had still carried himself like time would never catch him. Emily had prepared her own box on the dining room table before he arrived. For most of the afternoon, the family traded years. Malcolm saw Boone beside Walter at a lake, lying patiently under a folding chair while the old man fished. Emily saw Boone in a military harness, standing beside Malcolm with sharp eyes and young strength. Walter's nephew laughed at a picture of Boone wearing a red bandana at Christmas, while Malcolm quietly studied a photo of the old man asleep in a recliner, with one hand resting on Boone's back. The missing years became visible, not complete, but no longer empty. Emily told him Walter had spoken to Boone every morning after breakfast, as if the dog understood every word. A neighbor remembered Boone, walking beside Walter to the mailbox in all weather. Someone else recalled that Walter had started going back to church after Boone came into the house, because the dog gave him a reason to leave the porch. Malcolm listened carefully. At one point, Emily pushed a small envelope across the table. Inside were printed photos she had copied for him, along with a note Walter had written on the back of one picture. "Found him when I needed something to find me back." Malcolm read the sentence twice. Then he folded the note carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket. On the drive home, he understood something that had taken him a long time to accept. Boone's missing years had not been a blank space filled only with suffering. They had held pain, neglect, and unanswered questions, but they had also held a lonely widower who needed a reason to keep going, and a dog who knew how to sit close when words became too heavy. Boone had not stopped being loved. The love had simply come from different hands. Spring returned to Whitefish slowly, first in the smell of thawing soil, then in the sound of water moving beneath the melting snow along the ditches. The mountains still held winter on their peaks, but the valley began turning green in patient patches. Boone spent more afternoons outside, lying on the porch where the sun could warm his old bones. Murphy ran circles through the yard as if spring had personally invited him to celebrate. Claire came over one Saturday carrying an apple pie covered with a clean kitchen towel. She said it was an experiment and that Malcolm was morally obligated to help judge the result. Murphy nearly knocked into her knees while chasing a tennis ball, but the pie survived, which Claire called proof that God still liked them. The afternoon settled gently around the cabin. Boone rested near the porch steps, his head lifted toward the breeze. Claire poured coffee from a thermos, while Murphy investigated something deeply suspicious near the fence line. Malcolm sat quietly for a while, watching the ordinary scene unfold with a feeling he did not try to name too quickly. Then he went inside. When he returned, he was carrying Boone's old stainless steel bowl. The metal had dulled over the years, and the rim still carried a small dent from a camping trip long before Boone vanished. Malcolm had kept it through every move, every winter, and every attempt to convince himself that holding on was foolish. He walked down the porch steps and placed it on the familiar spot near the grass. Boone watched him. Malcolm filled the bowl and stepped back. For a moment, the old shepherd remained where he was, as if measuring the distance. Then he pushed himself up, slow and careful, and made his way down the steps. His paws touched the grass with the patience of an animal that had learned to take nothing for granted. He reached the bowl, lowered his head, and ate until it was empty. Malcolm stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at the dog he had lost, found, nearly lost again, and learned to share with the memory of another man. The years between them had not disappeared, and they never would. They had become part of the story now, woven together with Spokane woods, Montana snow, Walter's porch, Claire's quiet kindness, Murphy's ridiculous optimism, and the stubborn love that had kept one phone number alive for far longer than anyone understood. Boone lifted his head from the empty bowl and looked back at him. Malcolm did not say anything. He did not need to. The bowl was where it belonged. Boone was home, and the space that had followed Malcolm for 5 long years had finally grown quiet. Before we wrap up, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever held on to hope longer than anyone thought you should? Have you ever been reunited with a beloved pet, a friend, or even a piece of your life you thought was gone for good? Feel free to share your memories, experiences, or prayers in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about ordinary people, loyal animals, and the quiet ways life surprises us, please consider liking and subscribing. What stays with me from this story isn't really the reunion. It's the realization that while Malcolm spent 5 years wondering where Boone was still living a life. He was helping a widower through lonely mornings. He was sitting beside a porch swing. He was walking to a mailbox with someone who needed company more than he needed conversation. For a long time, Malcolm imagined those missing years as empty space. Most of us probably do the same thing with parts of our own lives. We look back at seasons marked by loss or uncertainty and assume nothing good could have happened there. Then, years later, we discover that life was still moving. People were still helping one another. Small acts of kindness were still changing someone's day. Maybe that's one of the gentlest forms of grace. Not that everything works out exactly as we hoped, but that goodness sometimes continues quietly in places we cannot see. This story is fictional, but the emotions behind it are very real. Many people know what it feels like to miss someone, to keep a phone number, a photograph, or an old belonging long after others have told them it's time to let go. As I picture Boone resting on that porch in Whitefish, while Murphy races through the yard and Claire carries over a homemade pie, I don't think about the years they lost. I think about the fact that somehow, after all that time, there was still a place waiting for him at the end of the day. And honestly, that thought stays with me.